Today's lesson is on the history of counseling psychology. This is chapter 2 in your book. Just a couple announcements before we start. The first is that you should be working on your role play paper. This is the paper where you're reflecting on your role play sessions. There are 6 sections to the paper, so you can break those up into different sections. In at least one of the sections, the links to counseling literature, you should be bringing in scientific sources on counseling. So there's a few suggestions I have for when you're looking for articles. I would suggest using PsycInfo or Google Scholar and searching the basic things that we've been um, studying and role playing. So, open ended questions, self disclosure. Sometimes these are called micro skills, or working alliance, or reflective listening, unconditional positive regard, or empathy. These might be things that you practice in your session, and so you could write about those. Here are just some examples down at the bottom of research on therapist techniques and brief individual therapy, reflective listening and counseling, reflective listening and open ended questions in counseling. These are just some articles I found after I did some searches. So these are just some ideas for you as you're looking for articles to match sort of what you did in your session, but obviously you can take liberty and look on your own as well. Also, we'll be having the final exam on May 11th, so be looking out for that. It's the same format as the last one, which will be on Blackboard. And then just a few other notes is that course evaluations are open, so you can evaluate the class. I know this is sort of a weird semester to evaluate, but I will give extra credit if over 70% of the class fills out the course evaluations. I can't see who fills them out, but just the percentage of people who have filled them out. So, like I mentioned, this chapter is on history of counseling psychology. Counseling, in particular, counseling psychology started in the early 1900s. Frank Parsons was a sort of leader in the field and developed this idea of vocational guidance and school guidance. Frank Parsons is regarded as one of the founders of this movement and really developed this talent matching approach, which later turned into the trait and factor theory, which we've talked about with vocational psych and career counseling. That people have certain traits or talents and they need to be matched to the correct occupations. So counseling psychology really comes out of this work psychology, vocational psychology background. Um, so again, at the center of this theory is the concept of matching. And Parsons states that when people make good occupational choices, it's when they have a good understanding of their own individual traits, their interests, their personal abilities, their aptitudes, a knowledge about the jobs and the labor market, and then can judge um, the fit. Now, clinical psychology has a little bit different background. Clinical psychology, if you think back with Freud and some other clinical folks that we've talked about, they're more focused on hospitals and severe mental illness, whereas counseling psych really grew out of this career approach. Then in World War II, many psychologists were being employed by the army, by the military, and they worked in assessment. And they sort of did the same thing. So they were trying to select military personnel and match them to different um, jobs, and then would train these people in these jobs. So they were involved in this selection process and matching people to different fields. If anyone knows people in the military, they'll often still sort of do these sort of aptitude and placement tests. Psychologists also started attending to psychological issues that came up in the military. So in World War II, often people would come back with something called shell shock, and this sort of grew our understanding of what we now call PTSD. So psychologists started really working both in school settings, vocational settings, and the military. And then counseling psychologists in particular wanted to move beyond just working in hospitals and the military. Remember, a lot of psychologists were just working with severe, like schizophrenia or other severe mental illness, or the military, and they wanted other people to benefit from psychology, from counseling. And so they really pushed to broaden the field to include more civilian populations and broader um, populations. So in the late 1940s, Division 17 was formed. Um, this has changed its names throughout history, but it was formed by E.G. Williamson and John Darley. And at first, it was more called Counseling and Guidance. Now it's the Society of Counseling Psychology. And there's a website, division17.org, that you can check out. I'll briefly pull it up and take a look around. So here's the website, the Society of Counseling Psychology, and there's a bunch of different resources here about counseling psychology, publications, sections, and so on. So I would encourage you to check out div17.org. One theme that comes up when you look at the history of counseling psychology is that counseling psychology has had some identity issues. Where does it fit? And there's this perennial question of what makes counseling psychology unique. And like the book mentioned, like I'm mentioning, is that it's wrestled with finding its unique place in the field for many, many years. So we're going to talk about where it currently sort of sits. So counseling psychology sits in between, as it would make sense, the broad field of psychology and the field of counseling. Now, what do I mean by this? Psychology tends to focus on research. So research in psychology, they're doing empirical studies, measurement. If you think about all your other psychology classes, there's a strong emphasis on research. And counseling psychology also believes in research, and this is why it's situated within psychology. Now, the counseling field in general focuses on therapy, individual therapy, group therapy, and there are master's level counselors who are not counseling psychologists. So this would be people that are sort of over here that are counselors, but are now not counseling psychologists. And they would have less training in research, less training in studies, but they'd have similar training background in therapy. So counseling psychology really is the overlap of these two fields, psychology as a whole and counseling, where it's blending research and therapy sort of together and sort of fits in this space between. A few other things to note is that in the US, in order to be a psychologist, you have to be a doctor. So you have to have a doctorate that's can be a PhD or something called a PsyD. Whereas in the US, in order to be considered a counselor, you often have to have a master's. Um, so counseling psychologists, because they're psychologists like me, have a doctorate. Some of us also have masters as well. But that's just a little bit of what sets these two fields apart. And again, counseling psychologists really focus on the equal parts scientists, which is the psychology, and practitioners, which is the counseling. And they'll use these two to inform each other. So as you're doing therapy, a counseling psychologist might have an idea for a research study, and then that'll bring out the scientist and they'll do the research study, which hopefully will impact the practice of counseling and so on. So these two go together back and forth. And again, to be a counseling psychologist, you have to be a doctor. Now, counseling psychology is also related to a bunch of other fields in psychology um, and broader, even beyond psychology. So it is similar to industrial organizational psychology, which focuses on workplace, career, and satisfaction. I mentioned about this in the vocational chapters that industrial organizational psychologists also focus on work, but they're focusing on it from the aim of the employer. So, how do I make my employees happy? How do I um, maximize efficiency? Things like that. Where counseling psychologists also work in the field of work, but focus on the side of the employee. There's some overlap with school psychology, as there's this overlap of school to work transitions, career choices, mental health. But school psychologists also have particular training in issues related to school. Counseling psychology is similar to clinical psychology, where you focus on treating mental illness, and it's similar to community psychology, where you're focusing on issues related to culture, structures, institutions, laws, and how they impact people. So, community psychologists would study the ways that various cultures, communities, nations, and things impact people. So, counseling psychology sort of sits in the middle of all of these. And there's going to be some similarities and differences. And one that gets sort of confusing for people is the difference between a clinical psychologist and a counseling psychologist. So that is what we'll talk about in the next slide. So this slide is about the historical difference between these two fields. Nowadays, there's not that much difference between the two. We both can be licensed psychologists, but historically they were sort of separate and now they're sort of merging together. So clinical psychologists often have focused on treating people who have had serious or persistent mental illness. This might be things like schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, um, and so on. So, clinical psychologists, again, historically have worked on the more severe end of the spectrum of mental illness, where counseling psychologists work with people more on the whole spectrum. So, they might work with people on the milder side of mental illness or somewhere in between. We also get training on the more serious side as well, but counseling psychologists really don't focus just on serious mental illness. They might focus on healthy individuals who are just wanting and striving to be better, do their best. Clinical psychology has often taken a pathology view of mental health where they're focusing on the things going wrong, Dysfu- excuse me, dysfunction, um, breakdowns in social functioning, cognitive functioning, and so on. So they're going to focus on things going wrong historically. And counseling psychologists do tend to have more training in focusing on strengths. They might focus more on adaptive functioning and multicultural issues. So oftentimes, counseling psychologists have a bit broader scope. Clinical psychologists are more likely to work in psychiatric hospitals with psychiatrists, whereas counseling psychologists are more likely to work in education, community centers, and so on. But just so you know, currently they've again sort of more melded together. There's more similarities between the two fields than differences. Both can be licensed psychologists, both can be health service psychologists. So there's really not too much different. They started out quite separate, but now they're more similar. So, where has counseling psychology landed in this identity crisis that it faces? Well, the book talks about how we've sort of carved out five central values of a counseling psychologist or counseling psychology, and we'll talk about those next. The first is that counseling psychology will have a broad view. So there's a real push to focus on strengths and optimal functioning. Our bias in psychology is to focus on deficits, things that are going wrong. Someone comes in complaining about something going wrong in their life, struggling with something, and that's very important. But they're going to try to also look at what are these person's strengths. They've been surviving out there on their own, and maybe the strength is their resilience. Maybe their strength is that they knew when they needed to ask for help. So there's going to be these positive reframes. There's going to be um, looking for ways that people can grow and get better. So it's not just focusing on assessing what's going wrong. There's a focus on development and vocational growth across the lifespan. So we realize that humans are not static, that they grow and they change. Um, and counseling psychologists really pay attention to this. And with vocational growth, it's going to look at ways that people might change careers, might um, find different passions or callings for their job. Otherwise, it's just focusing on development, personal development, different ways that you can grow throughout the lifespan. There's a real strong commitment to social justice and multiculturalism in counseling psychology. Of a lot of the fields that I looked into, this is what drew me to counseling psych. And they're really going to focus not just on individuals, but individuals in context. So they're going to look at the impact of culture, societal structures on individuals. In my research, look at the effects of discrimination and different factors that impact the lives of LGBT people. And so counseling psychologists don't just look at the individual, but the individual in context of the society. They do like to focus on brief educational and preventative interventions. So rather than just focusing on when things are going wrong, we want to be preventative and try to build in ways that things can go right from the beginning. We also realize that to go into therapy for years takes resources and money. And so there is a focus on brief interventions, educational interventions that can be done to large groups of people with hopefully um, high impact. And as I've been discussing, there's this strong adherence to the scientist practitioner model. So we really do believe in the scientific practice of research, and that research will inform how to do therapy or practice. And practice, when you are in the therapy room, will help us learn new ideas that we need to research. So this scientist practitioner model is really big, that science informs practice, practice informs science, and so on. It's a cycle. There are two primary journals in the field of counseling psychology. The first is JCP, or the Journal of Counseling Psychology, and the second is TCP, or the Counseling Psychologist. And these journals focus on a lot of things. They are research journals, so this is where people publish their research, and the research will be on things like counseling, different counseling techniques, different trends in counseling. They'll be doing research on how to do assessment for different functioning levels, looking broadly at positive strengths and so on. These journals, because of our history, will do a lot of career and educational, vocational psychology topics. As I've mentioned, counseling psychology tends to focus on diversity and underrepresented populations. So there'll be a lot of research published on these groups and how to get um, services to these groups and so on that are underrepresented in counseling. And they'll publish articles on professional issues, whether it's ethics or, again, trends in the field, um, anything that might be relevant to counseling psychologists. So these are the two primary journals. And I just went online and picked a few samples of recent articles. So in the Journal of Counseling Psychology, these are some recent articles from 2018. And you can see that we've covered a lot of these things in our class already, or at least have touched on these. So looking at workplace climate and satisfaction in sexual minority populations, an application of the social cognitive career theory. This relates to vocational psych and career counseling, as well as diversity. Another is self-affirming values to increase student veterans' intentions to seek counseling. So this is, you can think about our history with the military, history with positive psychology. So we're still doing research in these areas. Client laughter and psychodynamic psychotherapy, looking at different theories, psychology of working among different diverse employed adults, and then self-disclosure. So these are just some article titles that fit with what you've been learning about counseling psychology. And so these are researchers who have published these articles. And then looking at the other main journal, The Counseling Psychologist, here are some, again, some recent articles looking at discrimination among Arab Americans, class stigma in college students and attitudes towards counseling, stigma, coping. So this would be positive, how people cope with challenges. Another positive psychology article. And then working with, again, more positive psych or LGBT and positive psych, looking at coping. So hopefully this gives you a good idea of research being done in the field in the past few years. And you can always go into the library and the database, check out PsycInfo, and look at recent articles in either the Counseling Psychologist or the Journal of Counseling Psychology. So this is my overview of chapter 2. For the next video, we'll talk about the final chapter, chapter 17.